Hi, everybody. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on what part of the world you're in. Thank you very much for joining us today for this session on new trends in telecoms, media, and technology, succeeding in the coordination age. So today we are here with Andrew Collinson, who is our research director, as well as myself. I'm a senior analyst at STL Partners, and David Pringle, he's an associate senior analyst with us. And we're each going to present in the order on the slide here, and we're going to follow by a question and answer period. So please, throughout this session, do submit your questions to us. You should have, as the picture on the slide shows right now, a little panel that says questions on it. Type them in as we go along, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. We will also share a recording of this webinar with you after it's over. And if you want to download the slides, they are available on the little toolbar that says handouts. You can download that PDF from here. Otherwise, we will also send out an email with a copy of the PDFs afterwards, so you can get it that way. So now, without further ado, I will pass on to Andrew, who will take over the first part of this session.
Thanks, Amy, and good afternoon, everyone. So this afternoon, I'm just going to run through very quickly what we mean by the coordination age. And some of you will have heard some of this before, so I'm going to try and curtail the introduction, but just make sure everyone's got a common understanding. And then hopefully what Amy and David will be able to do is bring through how this is manifesting itself in the consumer and enterprise markets in certain ways. So the coordination age, what am I talking about? Apologies, I'm just trying to get the slides to work for me. Okay, I'm jumping over a bunch of stuff here, which is about us, though it's just worth saying, I hope most of you know about us. What I'm talking about here is on the far right-hand side of this page about the coordination age. The other bubbles here show some of the things we've been looking at and still look at from time to time, and when we started our coverage about it. And I guess what we're trying to say here is we've got quite a good track record of looking at new stuff early on. So coordination age, what am I talking about? Let's get to that. So this started from a discussion about where is the telecoms market going? Because effectively, I think we're at the end of a cycle of growth in connectivity. So if you look back 30 years, you can see the market was still growing very fast, 22% a year. AT&T as a benchmark, 34 billion, now 158 billion. So you can see a huge growth in the marketplace, but there's no doubt that that growth is slowing down. And what we're saying is, especially when we look at some of the more recent numbers, and if you'll forgive me, I'm just trying to advance the slides, but having a little bit of a latency issue myself. So perhaps we could do with a 5G connection here if all we hear is true, because these slides are not advancing. Amy, do you think you could take over for a minute and see if you can advance these slides, because it's just not moving? Hello, Amy. I wonder if you can all hear me. I hope you can. Well, look, I'll keep talking anyway, because you've been very kind to join it, so I can talk without the pictures. But I'm sorry if that's a disappointment to you. So this, like, what I was going to say is we're reaching the end of the growth cycle of the. Oh look, we've let forward a number of slides. Marvelous. Of the connectivity market. And maybe if we can page back a few, Amy. I don't know if you can. Okay, I seem to have some control back over this. This is the chart I was trying to talk about, where we've got a very clear evidence that growth in revenue is coming to a halt. And what I think, if you look at that in a historical context, what that looks like to me is the end of a growth cycle in the industry. And I think it's the end of the connectivity growth cycle. That's not to say that people won't use more connectivity, but there's really very little evidence they will pay more for it. So the question is, what new job is there akin to the one that I saw 30 years ago when I joined the industry, which was all these unconnected people, no mobile, no fiber, and it's very obvious this stuff was going to happen. What else is out there? So we started looking at consumer needs, and in fact, what we looked at to begin with was worries. So when I looked at some survey information from Ipsos, what I saw was that the top worries that people have are all about resource allocation and distribution, which are both economic forms, which are coloured in red on this chart, and I've called them social, the ones that are coloured in orange. So there is a lot of care and concern, if you like, for people being able to get access to the things they want and need. And when I look more broadly and thought more broadly about it and talked to our analysts about it, it's not hard to spot problems in the world. You can see this all over the shop. You can see issues on productivity, waste, healthcare, economic barriers, climate change, etc. And I think quite a good summary of this, although I know it sounds a bit green and sustainable, is this idea that the world is actually using more than its sustainable resources. And I think that's quite a good paraphrase for the whole issue. And another one that I found was that Telia did a survey, Division X, which is their innovation team, which showed that 70% of their enterprise customers, 500 of them, rated resource efficiency as their top priority at 70%. And that means, and cost efficiency, cost cutting and efficiency was only 20%. So we're seeing here the overall problem being resource inefficiency. And that leads, we think, to quite an interesting argument and quite a compelling idea. So on the one hand, you've got opportunities to improve the access to information and services. And on the other, you've got the opportunity to improve getting what I want when I need it and reducing waste, which is both of these are really about optimizing supply and demand. And we also mentioned in this in the previous slide, there's a lot of conflict or potential conflict over resources at a macro level, which we talked about here. And again, there's the opportunity to do something about that if you can distribute resources more equally and more effectively. And on the other side of the equation, on the bottom right hand corner here, we've got technology. So on the supply side, we've got AI and automation and digitization, both of which can lead to opportunities for greater efficiency. They can also lead to opportunities for, or threats, if you like, for fears of employment. But again, we're not really going to cover that. I think there's quite a lot of discussion about that, and I think it's for another day. But in this whole equation, what we see is this general benefit of making the world run better as being a great opportunity, and what the world is looking for, what we are seeing as the meta trend of all of these other trends. And we think that presents an interesting opportunity for the telecoms industry. And we've coined the phrase coordination age because we feel that coordination is actually the thing that is needed to help deliver the benefit. So the organization of different elements of a complex body or activity so as to enable them to work together effectively. And what you'll see as we talk about some of the examples of this as they come into action is that they are indeed about managing complexity. But there's some quite interesting nuances to this, because whilst lots of people want coordination, very few people want to be coordinated by someone else. And that leads to some quite interesting aspects to the business model and the structure of the market that we expect to emerge. And this overall is leading to the idea of the coordination age. And to put that, to clarify the distinction of the coordination age here, we've put the communications age starting in 1850. So that overcomes the problems of distance, us talking to each other now. The information age, we're saying, started in 1990 because that's when computers really started to become connected. And that's both of these are still going on. These things are still in operation. But the difference with the coordination age is it's about the link between physical assets. And that, by physical assets, sorry, that can be quite an impersonal way to talk about people, but it talks about people, it talks about other resources, assets of businesses, personal assets, property, and so forth, and the digital stuff. So it's the link between the physical and the digital which is starting to happen, which we're calling the coordination age. So, and I should just say, the information age solved the problems of discovery, so you can look up anything on Google, and delivery, which is Netflix. You can get pretty much any content anywhere. The issue with coordination age is beyond that. It is that idea of coordination and making things work together. And the tech world is already stepping towards the coordination age. I'll just talk for a minute about BlaBlaCar, which is quite an interesting and unusual example. BlaBlaCar is a car sharing application where you choose the driver and the passenger of the car based on how much they want to talk. And it's a not-for-profit deal. It's just to get people more efficient transport. So you can see that these things are arising all over the place, and the needs behind this are driving a lot of the other applications that we're a lot more familiar with. And the telecoms industry, use that advisedly, the telecoms industry, because there's a bit here about technology players in the industry and also telecoms operators. But focusing specifically on telecoms operators, data is obviously an essential enabler of coordination, and telcos have got it. There's also a toolkit developing here with 5G, Edge, NFV, SDN, and the Internet of Things. And this all looks to me like an agility, or more like a flexibility toolkit to allow stuff to be delivered more, out on demand to customers in different times and places. And there's also an issue for telcos. I mentioned this business of being in the physical world. Well, the information age, in a way, didn't suit the telcos because it suited global players, because information is weightless, and so that favors global players like Google and Apple and so on. Whereas the physical world is generally managed by rules that are operated on a much more localized level, and particularly on a national level. And this is where there's an alignment with government and other national frameworks, which means the telecom operators have an opportunity, if they can align themselves successfully, both objective and in mindset, with those players. And we can talk a lot more about that another time. Last but not least, obviously, the Internet of Things and the connectivity there is an important part of it, but by no means all. So there's a bunch of things that mean that telcos can be playing in it, but there's this absolutely critical point here, which is telcos aren't investing to do this kind of stuff. And yet again, I've got a bit of a problem making the chart move. So apologies, dear watchers. Amy, I don't know if you can help me here, because I can't make this chart work. Oh, here we go. This chart shows on the left-hand side research and development OPEX as a percent of revenue. So that is OPEX, and the bottom side shows CAPEX as a percent of revenue. What you can see is the telecoms operators here in the bottom right-hand corner very much investing in CAPEX and very little in R&D OPEX, whereas most of the technology players are investing in both CAPEX and OPEX, so CAPEX in the form of data centers and so forth. Typically, and CAPEX is typically called a CAPEX investment strategy, sometimes talked about as being creating a moat, something that's expensive and difficult to cross. But unfortunately, the moat of the operators has rather been breached by the data connectivity cycle. So there is a big question. Do telcos sit at this road? Do they stay where they are? Do they continue to retrench in capital moat building? Or do they move to a greater mix of more highly valued service operation? And we've just published a paper on that last week, talking to CFOs about how they need to reconsider their investment approach, because we think this is incredibly important, because this is a really big decision. And broadly, what you might put this in is to say, well, do you keep chucking your money after 5G, or all of your money, because there's no doubt you need to do some of that stuff, but really you should be investing more of your investment priorities in some of these other areas. So in any event, this is what the old world looked like. Telecoms will grow, we're all fine, and we need to find the next killer app. I can't remember how many times I've heard that. The truth is, as we see it, telecoms is finite, and the growth goal is not to find one thing, it's to find many different things and solve many different problems, and that will involve different types of service and new ways of doing business. And clearly we have a much more complex and dynamic market environment. Now, that's not news, but I think this idea about looking for many different problems to solve is quite important, because I think it's actually been a perceptual barrier to the industry, because it's kept looking for the one big killer app and it wants the next big thing, and I just don't think that exists, or at least we haven't seen it in the last 12 years, and there's no sign of it emerging. So in summary, we see there being two jobs. One, enhance the connection job, and there's certainly stuff that can be done there, and there are certainly economies in which connection can be significantly improved. In fact, most economies can improve it, but there's a question to the overall speed and rate and returns on that type of activity. But there's also this prospect of helping make the world run better. And we're saying telcos don't have to do both, but they can. And they can just do the first one, or they can look at the second one as well. So what are the consequences of that? Again, my apologies, I'm finding trouble making this slide advance. So Amy, if you could step in and move it on one, that would be great. Thank you. So the consequences of this, this seeing the world like this, first of all, is the context. Thinking about this world changes the way you see the world and what you think you should be investing in and how you prioritize money and people, clearly, but money is a big part of this. Secondly, motivation. The idea that you could do something useful in the world is actually an incredibly powerful motivator. And I remember when I joined the industry many years ago, I felt it was a very motivating and inspiring place, and it's lost some of that. I think this possibly gives it a reason to change. And last but not least, I talked about this idea of a new role with consumers and other types of customers. And I didn't really concentrate much on the government, but the point here is if your objective is really aligned with that of the government, it gives you an entirely different basis for conversation about how you operate within an economy and a society. And we think that's a big change for many operators over what has been seen over many years of that kind of we're someone to tax and regulate. But actually, if you're in partnership, it's quite a different proposition. And further consequences are we believe that you'll see a move from a world of connected things, because I don't really buy the IoT as it currently sits. And we'll talk about some of the stuff that's in that actually in forthcoming areas. But I think what we're going to need is something that's a little bit more dynamic and autonomous than that, which we're calling the Internet of For Things. And you'll see some research from us on that. I think you're going to see a big change from big tech push to need pull. You really need to be understanding the needs of customers to get to win in this world, not just producing, rolling out the next G. And that's going to involve a lot of IT and ICT type work. And lastly, we think the business model will gradually change. Now, it may not change wholesale to reflect this because it's quite difficult to get people to pay for outcomes for all sorts of reasons that we don't have time to go in here. But there's definitely a pressure to do that we've noted across the marketplace. So I've talked here at a very high level and a little bit about some of the things we're going to do. I'm going to pass over now to David, who's going to talk about the consumer space.
Hi, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I'm David Pringle. I'm going to talk about the smart home in the context of the coordination age and essentially how the smart home fits into that big picture that Andrew presented. So why are we interested in the smart home now? I mean, the concept's been around for probably decades, but there's a couple of things going on. On the supply side, the cost of connectivity is coming down. The cost of obviously Wi-Fi and cellular connectivity have been coming down over time, but also the cost of modules, which means it's more cost effective to connect appliances and devices, etc., throughout the home. But probably more importantly, on the demand side, we now have a situation where people are in many parts of the world accumulating assets. They're accumulating things that they want to look after. They want to be able to monitor. They're concerned about security, crime. We've got issues around rising inequality. And at the same time, we've got this growth of the sharing economy and wanting to take advantage of services like Airbnb, which allow you to share your home with potential tenants, holiday makers, etc. But also take in deliveries. You sometimes need to give remote access to a delivery person or a maintenance person, etc. So householders have genuine needs around the smart home. And as I say, you can think of them broadly around peace of mind and the importance of security and privacy. We say in the UK that an Englishman's home is his castle, and that concept is still alive and well, but also support for this sharing economy and delivery online services, etc. Now, to meet these demands, you need a very convenient and straightforward solution that actually enables a householder to easily see what's happening with their home and all their assets in one place. So the way we'd envisage this is some kind of dashboard that says, okay, here are all my assets, here's their status, here's whether they're insured or not, here's how much energy they're using, and you have this complete picture of what is going on in your home and those related assets, which could be your car, could be your bike, could be your pets, etc. Now, in the context of that, you can have all sorts of use cases. You might see that your son has spent too long on the Xbox and you want to be able to remotely turn off the Xbox so that your son does something more productive instead, or you may want to be able to check that the amount of energy your solar panels are producing and then use some of that energy to start charging your electric car. Or another use cases, you may want to check which windows or doors are open from the security peace of mind context. And if you could see that all through one single dashboard, that would be highly convenient. So one important point here is it's not about smart speakers in the context that smart speakers are important, people enjoy using them, etc., but they don't actually address a lot of the key smart home use cases that are arising in the age that we live in. And essentially, a lot of them require a more private and visual interface where you can see what's happening in your home and you can do it in the privacy of a smartphone or tablet screen rather than speaking into a smart speaker. So essentially, smart speakers are important, but they are not synonymous with the smart home and meeting consumers' demands in this space. So moving to my next slide, we're going to look in particular at the role of telcos in the smart home. And a lot of telcos are targeting the entertainment space. And I would suggest that if you're providing entertainment in the home, you should also be looking at smart home services as well, because consumers are looking for that convenience. They're looking for that one-stop shop. They're looking to control their entertainment assets, their entertainment appliances, as much as they're looking to control their dishwasher or their air conditioning or their central heating. Now, because there's so many elements to this, insurance, utilities, security, entertainment, etc., we don't think that one single player can provide all these pieces. Not even Amazon or Google, etc., has all the capabilities and the assets in place to provide a complete smart home solution. So we see telcos potentially as what we essentially, for want of a better word, systems integrators, where they can pull these various players together and provide a single dashboard, a single interface through which these services are coordinated and the consumer gets that complete picture I was talking about earlier. Now, the reason telcos could potentially do this is because all of these services rely on connectivity, and the connectivity has to be ultra reliable. It also has to be secure because we're talking about very personal information here. And this would, in our view, be a combination of both Wi-Fi and some cellular technologies, which could be some of the new low power wide area networks such as narrowband IoT, LTE-M, and potentially 5G when it comes down the track. But the connectivity is absolutely crucial to this. If you don't have it, you don't have a smart home, and it needs to be everywhere throughout the home. So telcos already have that segue into the consumer space here, and then could play that coordinating role on top of that connectivity piece. Another crucial element as well, particularly here in Europe but in other markets as well, is that people value privacy, and they're concerned about where their data is going and how it's being used, etc. And telcos, because they have a presence in a market, because they're regulated, there is a certain element of trust that they will look after your data, and that data could be stored in a local data center of some kind in market, or it could be even held securely within the consumer's home. So essentially, telcos have both a connectivity role to play and a coordination role in what is essentially quite a complex space, the smart home. So I'm just going to quickly take you through 3 examples of telcos looking to coordinate the smart home. We have Deutsche Telekom here in Europe. They have the Magenta Smart Home, and one of the differentiators for that service is that they talk about encrypting the communications, storing the data in Germany, or locally on the smart home gateway if the customer prefers that. And here's a shot from the Deutsche Telekom app, which shows the kind of information that they're providing through this service. Deutsche Telekom also has an open platform so that other telcos can take advantage of the same architecture, and that gives them some economies of scale, etc. Where it falls down somewhat is that their app has received fairly mixed reviews. People find it a bit clunky. There's been some technical issues, etc. So that app needs to improve urgently, because of essentially the whole point of a smart home is providing convenience and ease of use that consumers don't have today. Now, Deutsche Telekom has partnered with Orange and has actually, ironically, produced their own smart speaker. Orange has even broader aspirations than Deutsche Telekom, in the sense that it's playing in financial services. It has Orange Bank. It has a pretty ambitious entertainment play. It's also looking into utilities, providing utility services, partly in Africa as well as in Europe. The question with Orange is it stretching itself too thin, and is it attempting to provide too many of the pieces itself rather than playing the coordination role that we were talking about earlier? So there is a balance here between providing these services, but also coordinating the best of breed services from elsewhere. I'm finally going to touch on AT&T. Now, AT&T has had its digital life service alive for quite some time now. Its uptake has been quite modest, and one of the reasons for that is originally it was quite a closed solution. You couldn't just integrate appliances of your choice. You had to use a particular set of appliances, a particular set of systems, etc. So you were immediately limiting consumers' choice, and it's also a very expensive service by European standards, certainly, and that has somewhat undermined that offering, and it's had quite limited uptake. Now, the worry there for AT&T is that it sort of impacts the effectiveness of its entertainment proposition in the home as well, because if consumers are looking for one-stop shops, such as Comcast is offering both entertainment and a security solution around the smart home, then they may go to a different service provider than AT&T. Now, to AT&T's credit, though, it has seen the potential of low power wide area technologies in this space, and is exploring how to provide connectivity throughout the home using things like narrowband IoT and LTE-M as a backup or an alternative to Wi-Fi, and of course it's looking at 5G in that context as well. So there's three very interesting plays there from telcos, but all with their strengths and weaknesses. And I just want to conclude by saying that we don't think that any of the internet players at this point is positioned to dominate this market, partly because of concerns about the way they might use the data. If you've got a smart speaker listening to your conversations in your home, or essentially sort of proactively making suggestions and recommendations to you, some consumers may find that quite creepy and something of an intrusion. Telcos need to kind of clearly differentiate themselves from that kind of proposition. So I'll stop there. There's lots more I could say about the smart home, but I'll leave that potentially for your questions later, and hand over to Amy.
Great, thank you, David. So I will just use this moment as an opportunity to say to everybody, we'd love to have your questions. So do feel free to submit them, and we'll get around to them in just a few minutes after I've talked about healthcare. So here I just want to stress that we're using healthcare as an example of how the coordination age idea plays out in an enterprise vertical, in the enterprise market. But this could be, lots of other verticals where there's a big challenge with many different types of enterprise players in the market, linking to consumers, a lack of digitization generally, and data security issues. These are things that play across many different industries. But healthcare is an interesting one, particularly because it's a deeply physical need. Our healthcare needs happen in the physical world. They cannot be solved in the digital world only. So you really do need to be able to coordinate across, the advances in technology that we have, but bringing that to our, real life selves. And I think that it's kind of different than the smart home, because in the smart home, the buyer for the smart home technology is the same as the buyer for the connectivity. But in enterprise, and I think this is true in lots of different areas, the buyer of your IT services is different than the buyer of connectivity. And that makes it more challenging for telcos when they're trying to succeed in those areas. So why do healthcare systems need better coordination? I'm sure I'll go through this quickly because I think it's things that everybody is familiar with. But in developed markets, we're facing aging populations, and that means costly long-term care for chronic illnesses. And particularly in single-payer markets, they don't know how they're going to deal with this. They don't have the budget, and they're sort of everybody is very stressed about how are we going to meet these needs. If we look at emerging markets, it's more of a question of people just simply don't have access to healthcare, and that's because there aren't enough doctors, and because there isn't any affordable insurance coverage. So most people don't even have insurance, so they don't get treated because they can't afford to pay for treatment. And this is also impacted by tight healthcare budgets. Again, this is developed markets and developing markets equally. But tight budgets, the main result of that is that there's very limited IT expertise, and this means they can't develop these solutions for themselves. This is why they haven't adopted the available technology yet. And this is being pressured from the other direction about evolving patient or customer expectations, and this is driven by sort of the explosion in wearables and the associated apps that we use to track our fitness and to track our health, and those wearables becoming more advanced, like the Apple Watch having ECG capabilities on it. That is making us think that we should have all of that from our healthcare providers as well. Likewise, the whole wearables area is blurring the lines between what is healthcare and what is wellness. And we're starting to think of healthcare as sort of a much more holistic thing. And therefore, we want much more holistic solutions that require a greater level of coordination between all the different players. And finally, there's growing data privacy concerns. And I think that, in the current climate that we're in, this is particularly important in healthcare, where people are seeing how their consumer data is being used in lots of ways they didn't anticipate. And that becomes much more worrying when it becomes our health data, because the impact is obviously bigger in many different kinds of ways. So what is the key barrier to making this happen? Obviously, we know that these are the issues. Why isn't it happening beyond lack of IT expertise? The main biggest challenge is the need for secure data sharing across so many different players. So I have here just a quick illustration of some of the players that you'll have. All of these players have different IT systems, different ways of tracking patient records, different types of data that they're using, and they don't want to share between one another because they don't know what's going to happen to that data when they share, and they don't know how to share it. So this is a huge problem. And I think just to give you a real world example, lots of patients now want to be able to share data from their fitness trackers with their GPs to illustrate healthcare issues that they may be feeling. But for a GP or for your family doctor, one, they don't know how to consume that data. They're not going to look at months of data from your Fitbit because they don't have time to. They're very time pressured. But also, once they look at that data, they become liable to do something about it. And if they don't know how to react, there aren't processes in place, then they just don't want to see that data. So it's not just getting the data from A to B, but also thinking about how it needs to be presented or in such a way that is useful for everybody in the ecosystem. As I touched on before, the next question is, how are we using patient data to develop more preventative care? If we want to move from reactive healthcare to preventative healthcare, we need to be using more sophisticated analytics to understand when patients are likely to get a disease before they will. But if we can't be sure how that data is being used, then is it worth the risk? And the example in the UK is that Google's DeepMind has been working with the NHS, and that's been very contentious because although they have very advanced analytics and can surely help develop some predictive medicine, what else might Google be using that data for? We don't know. So that's a big question, and sort of highlights the importance of telcos as potential players in this market, because they are locally regulated, because they have stronger relationships with the regulators. They are potentially in a better position to deal with these challenges. So breaking it down into 4 key areas, like we've talked about, the coordination age, there's so many different people that we're trying to coordinate. There isn't a killer app. You won't be able to do it all. So I've broken down the healthcare digital health market into these 4 areas. So if we start on the top left, we've got consumer wellness and self-care, and that's kind of the wearables or acts to, personal health management apps, and that's, B2C market. If we move then to the top right, we've got remote care and delivery, and that's linking IoT devices back into the formal healthcare sector. So that's like if I'm a cardiac patient and I've just been discharged from a surgery, I might have an IoT device at home that monitors my vital signs and sends that information back to the hospital. So it's much more of a B to B to C kind of system. Next, we have insurance and administrative reform, and that's everything in the back end to make everybody be able to talk to each other better, easier data sharing between providers. And in the US, there's the whole element of Amazon and the PillPack acquisition, which is about a much leaner supply chain for prescription drugs. That doesn't necessarily apply everywhere, but definitely in the US that would fall in that category. And finally, in the bottom left, you have data from the first 3, all feeding into this AI-enhanced healthcare, which is, right across all elements of the healthcare ecosystem. For telcos, I think that, they love the idea of the consumer because they want to get closer to the consumer, but actually it's very difficult for telcos to do because it requires huge global scale. It's much more about the user experience in the app, and that's the kind of place where we're seeing Apple do really well, and Fitbit and sort of those players. Other than that, the right-hand side is more interesting, and that's because these ones are more closely connected to the connectivity aspect. And particularly the bottom right, that's more about data exchange. So it plays into telco's strengths in dealing with transactions and transferring data bits from one place to another. So I'll just go through a few examples very quickly of how some telcos are playing a role in coordinating healthcare. So bringing back the 4 areas that I've talked about before. 2 good examples, sort of reaching out directly from the connectivity into the healthcare market, are AT&T and Vodafone. And they're basically looking at helping medical device players who are IoT customers deliver a more seamless experience. So they're not selling directly into hospitals or into GPs or other players in the health market. They are selling to medical device players who want to embed connectivity into their devices in order to make them more powerful, more useful to their end customers in the healthcare market. So this is really a little bit of still dabbling in the connectivity, just with a little bit of a healthcare spin. Next, we have Telus, and this is a Canadian operator, and they are the most advanced telco in healthcare that we know of globally. And they decided that they saw healthcare as an adjacent market opportunity, completely new business. And so they made a lot of acquisitions in IT systems for GPs. And that's because they saw GPs as the main gatekeepers, the main coordinators of healthcare between patients and hospitals and pharmacies and insurance providers. And so if we're using the terminology that Andrew brought up before, they bought a load of GP IT systems, and that was their moat in that area. And they have built up a lot of services on top of that, which allow them to get more into the remote care and delivery and monitoring, and leveraging some of the data that's traveling across those systems to develop predictive healthcare tools. In one final example before we wrap up, I've got Tonic, which is a subsidiary of Telenor, and it operates as a startup. And it's basically launched an entire new service. Again, this is an entire new business line, and its goal is to bring affordable insurance to Bangladesh. So rather than trying to reform an existing system, they're creating an entire new one because so many people in Bangladesh just don't have access to any insurance. And so they've taken a freemium model. They offer some free insurance and then upsell through many different ways. And this means that from the insurance side, they're then moving into thinking about how they can enhance on their insurance solutions to deliver more health management apps to consumers in Bangladesh who are now becoming more aware of digital health tools. And they're also thinking about how they can use analytics to be more efficient in the way they manage insurance claims and think about what kind of diseases people are likely to develop in certain circumstances. So we'll be covering all of these in a report that's actually forthcoming this week. So if you feel like you want more detail, it's coming very shortly. So I think now, sorry, we've overrun a little bit on our presentation, but I'll just let Andrew wrap up and then we'll hand over to questions. So do submit any if you have any.
Thanks, Amy. That was and David, a real tour de force there. I feel slightly overwhelmed with information. I'm sure the other people do. I'm just going to very quickly wrap up and say, what are we going to do about it? So go back to job 1 and job 2. Okay, so we're not ignoring job 1, which is the enhanced connectivity, because it's really important to do that, and how you become digital, how you change, etc., and what you do within that space. But also, what does job 2 look like? How do you develop and extend into this coordination age? If how do you find the right opportunities and make the plays, etc. So that's generally what we're going to do. And specifically, I guess everyone here is familiar with our research agenda overall, which this is all in the pack, so I'm not going to go through it here. We've added an NFE SDN stream for those of you who are relatively new to what we're doing. This slide, when you get to it, gives you a sense of the kind of stuff we're looking at in each area of our research activity. And again, we can talk about that some other time. And then you've got some other slides here which just give you an overview of the type of reports that are coming up, and the ones that David mentioned here: content, transportation, advertising, and control points in the coordination age, which I think is very important. And Amy's points here about the enterprise marketplace. Now, Amy and David are talking very much from the perspective of enterprise and consumer, as we discussed, and there's a bunch of other stuff we're doing about transformation and network technology like 5G and NFE and SDN, but those are slightly different issues about how you change and what you do, how you approach the underlying technologies, whereas what we've been talking about here is how the business models are evolving in each market, and how disruptive plays for operators are evolving too in that space. So I'm going to hand back to Amy. Thank you very much for listening. Appreciate you finding the time today. If you have any questions, we'd really like to hear them. So over to you, Amy.
Thanks, Andrew. So I'm going to start off with a question for David on smart homes. A lot of what you were talking about was that, this demand for privacy and security. What really is the demand for smart locks? Are we seeing really uptake for that yet? Are they ready?
Yeah, so I mean, there's two aspects to smart locks. I think one is the security, checking that you've actually locked the home, and when you've left, and when you're away on holiday, or in those kind of circumstances. And there's also this question of giving access to somebody who's renting your property, or friends, or relatives, or a delivery person who wants to drop off whatever you've ordered from Amazon, etc. So there is a genuine demand for smart locks, but they need cast iron connectivity. And I know that, for example, Singtel's invested in a startup company called Igloo Home, which is creating connected locks that use, I think, narrowband IoT as a potential way to provide that connectivity and enable people to remotely check these locks and whether they're being accessed or not. I think it's an important part of the piece, a very important piece of the puzzle, I should say, and essentially it meets that peace of mind criteria that we were talking about earlier. So, and I think it's an area telcos should be playing in, because the connectivity is so important in that kind of security use case, and potentially as trusted, in inverted commas, stroke regulated entities that have been around for a long time, telcos may be better placed to meet that demand than startups.
Thanks, David. Andrew, I'm gonna hand one to you now. So if we look at this, David is talking a lot about coordination services that run sort of their mass market propositions. They're very horizontal type solutions in some ways. Whereas in healthcare, that's very specific. That's really a vertical, and in some ways, it's very difficult to succeed beyond connectivity if you don't have a level of specialization. When you're thinking about about coordination age, do you think that there is sort of between doing those horizontal services or those vertical ones, sort of a best way to go for telcos?
Thanks, Amy. I don't think there's a single best way for telcos. I mean, so one thing I would say anyway is over the recent years, it's only over the last 3 to 4 years, what you see in the world is an increasing divergence between operators and what they're doing. So you both picked out examples here of people who've got different plays in different markets. For example, Telus in healthcare. Another one we've looked at is Elisa and some of the stuff they're doing in manufacturing and so forth. So first, there's no one size fits all, and they were specific vertical strategies that I talked about. Some of the bigger telcos may have opportunities, may have better opportunities to do horizontal plays of one sort or another because their scope is and reach is wider. But I don't think there's a single answer to that because I think it's very much a question that it depends. It depends on what the opportunities are in your marketplaces or the marketplaces you can reach. And I'd like to go back to Elisa for a minute to talk about that one. But so there's what the problems can you solve? What opportunities are within your reach, and what are your capabilities and assets in order to try and do that? And to some extent, there's also the question of timing. Is it already done? So you mentioned Telus were smart enough to get into their space early enough, whilst the coordination was still required, whereas the UK market is a little bit more, for example, established in that respect. The reason I wanted to go back to Elisa is that Elisa built this rather smart thing called, play on words, bad play on words, I mean, Smart Factory, which is a digital twins proposition, which they used their knowledge and expertise in how to create an automated network operations center and transferred that to manufacturing. They said, well, hang on, we know how to optimize a manufacturing process essentially. We could use that knowledge to help other people optimize their processes. So they've developed this proposition called a Smart Factory. What's interesting about Smart Factory, Elisa, if you don't know them, are a small Finnish operator, very innovative. They've got very innovative DNA, one of the most innovative operators I've seen. But their customers now are not just in the Finnish market. They have global customers for this proposition because they are doing something that other people haven't been able to do and haven't thought through, and they're also credible in the execution of that strategy. So it's not quite as easy as it might be to predict where your skills and assets may be applicable. So take, for example, in the case of Elisa, they've got one of the largest consumer brands organization in the world that work with them. So you wouldn't have thought that if you just said, if you looked at it in the cold hard light of day and said, oh, well, blimey, what's Elisa going to do in manufacturing on a global scale? You just said, well, that's a little bit of a pipe dream, isn't it? But actually, no, it isn't, because they've actually managed to do something really cool and good that's, demonstrably useful and credibly different from what else is in the world. So you've got a classic challenge here of weighing up a lot of different aspects to the equation of where you should be competing and how you might compete. But I would say a good way to start is to look close to home and say, what industries have you got on your doorstep and have you got good relationships with? Because at the end of the day, it's about solving problems. And through that, you may therefore develop solutions that branch onto other ones. And indeed, that's how Elisa started with their manufacturing thing. They started locally, but moved pretty quickly to a more global base because what they were doing with that was that advanced. So I hope that answers your question, Amy.
Andrew. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks.
So I'm going to take a question that's similar to what David got this morning about smart homes, which is how should telcos partner with global players in healthcare? So obviously we're familiar, I think, particularly with Apple, that's making a big punt into personal health records and helping individuals manage those. But also, so I think the question is, how should telcos partner with those that are addressing the consumer needs in digital health? So as I said, this is a very difficult one for telcos to do directly, and telcos have often tried to go direct to consumer with healthcare propositions. In the US, you may be familiar with Verizon that made a punt in that area in about 2013 with actually a decent personal health record proposition, but probably a bit early for the market because it was difficult for consumers to get any data in there, and they dropped it fairly quickly. But in terms of partnering, I think that telcos need to be pretty careful. So I would think that for telcos that are trying to make a move into the consumer health market or, do mass market stuff, it's more of a question of getting a footing in the enterprise space first. So thinking about, can we really address the concerns in the enterprise space, whether that's with IoT monitoring for health devices at home for hospital customers or for medical device customers, or whether that's on the insurance reform side to try and streamline the data exchange. And from there, I think they need to partner with those that are facing the consumer space by enabling consumer apps to interact more directly with GPs and with hospitals. But on the consumer space, you never know how that data is going to be used by companies whose business model it is to run analytics on that data. You never know where that data is going to get, and that's incredibly risky for a telco that's trying to position itself as the credible regulated player for data management in healthcare in their local market. So I would say that you need to keep a step back and say, we are doing the integration, we're allowing these consumer apps to interface more directly with the enterprise side, with the provider side of the market, but probably not get too far into the actual too deep into that relationship in order to protect their position as trusted players. I think that at this stage, probably we're going to wrap up because we're coming up to the hour. But if anybody has questions that we haven't answered or that you want to ask afterwards, please just do get in touch. We'd be very happy to answer them. So I think with that, thank you very much, David, for participating. Thank you, Andrew, for leading our session. And I wish you all a good day.
Thank you very much, Amy and Dave, and thanks everyone. Bye-bye.